I got the wrong alien sister pregnant. Now the other one wants it two-part. When Marcus Chen adjusted his diplomatic uniform for the 10th time as his shuttle descended toward the crystalline surface of Xylos Prime. The planet looked like a giant gemstone from space, its surface covered in towering crystal formations that caught and reflected the light of 3 suns. He had been chosen as Earth's first xenobiological liaison, a fancy title that basically meant he was supposed to make friends with aliens and convince them to trade with humanity. The mission was simple enough. The Xylari possessed technology that could revolutionize human space travel, while humans had agricultural techniques that could help feed the overcrowded crystal cities below. What nobody had mentioned in the briefing was that the Xylari were ruled by twin sisters who apparently did not get along very well. As his shuttle touched down in the main spaceport, Marcus could see hundreds of Xylari gathered to watch his arrival. They were beautiful in an otherworldly way, tall and slender with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. Their eyes were large and silver, and they moved with a grace that made Marcus feel clumsy just watching them. Most striking of all were the delicate patterns that glowed beneath their skin, constantly shifting and changing like living tattoos. A delegation approached his shuttle as the doors opened. At the front walked 2 Xylari, who were clearly the twin sisters he had been told about. They looked almost identical, but Marcus could sense the difference in their personalities immediately. The one on the left moved with measured, precise steps, her glowing patterns steady and controlled. The other walked with barely contained energy, her patterns flickering rapidly like she was barely keeping still. "Welcome to Xylos Prime, Ambassador Chen," said the composed one, extending her hand in what Marcus recognized as an adapted human greeting. "I am Zara, first Speaker of the High Council. This is my sister Kira, our chief scientist and military advisor." Marcus shook both their hands, trying not to stare at how their skin seemed to pulse with soft light at his touch. "Thank you for having me. I look forward to working with both of you to strengthen the bonds between our peoples." Kira laughed, a sound like crystal chimes. "Bonds indeed. You have no idea what you have gotten yourself into, human." Zara shot her sister a warning, look that Marcus pretended not to notice. Alien politics were complicated enough without getting caught in the middle of a family dispute on his first day. The next few hours were a whirlwind of formal ceremonies and introductions. Marcus met dozens of Xylari officials, each one more curious about humans than the last. They asked questions about everything from human reproduction to why humans ate cooked food instead of absorbing nutrients directly from crystals like they did. Some of the questions were embarrassing, but Marcus answered as diplomatically as possible. What he did not realize was that every breath he took was releasing pheromones that had never been encountered by Xylari biology before. To them, he smelled, like concentrated attraction and fascination rolled into one. The effect was subtle at first, just increased attention and friendliness, but it grew stronger as the day went on. The formal negotiations went better than anyone had hoped. The Xylari were genuinely interested in human agricultural techniques, especially the concept of crop rotation and soil enrichment. In return, they were willing to share some of their crystal-growing technology that could revolutionize human construction and energy storage. By evening, Marcus felt like he had accomplished more in one day than he had dared to hope for in a week. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The Xylari had prepared a feast in the Great Crystal Hall, a massive chamber carved from a single enormous crystal that refracted light in impossible ways. The food was strange but delicious, and the fermented crystal wine they served had a taste like liquid starlight. Marcus found himself sitting between Zara and Kira at the head table, both sisters competing to translate Xylari customs and keep his wine glass full. Zara explained the historical significance of each dish with scholarly precision, while Kira told wild stories about Xylari adventures and exploration. Both sisters seemed fascinated by everything about human culture, asking question after question about Earth and human society. As the evening wore on, Marcus began to notice that other Xylari in the hall kept glancing in their direction. The patterns under their skin were glowing brighter than before, and there seemed to be some kind of excitement building in the room. He mentioned this to Zara, who looked around with concern. That is unusual, she admitted. The collective resonance should not be this strong during a simple celebration. Kira, are you sensing anything unusual? Kira tilted her head, her eyes unfocusing slightly. The Xylari had a mild telepathic connection, Marcus knew, especially between family members. There is something in the air tonight, she said slowly. Something that makes everything feel more intense, more alive. It is coming from our guest. Marcus felt his cheeks heating up. I hope I am not causing any problems. Maybe I should return to my quarters. Nonsense, Zara said firmly. You are our honored guest. If there are effects we were not expecting, that only makes this evening more interesting from a scientific standpoint. The crystal wine continued to flow, and Marcus found himself relaxing, more than he had in months. The stress of being humanity's first alien ambassador was finally lifting, replaced by genuine enjoyment of Xylari company. Zara was brilliant and thoughtful, her mind sharp as the crystals that surrounded them. When she smiled, which happened more often as the evening progressed, her entire face lit up with an inner glow that took Marcus's breath away. As the formal celebration wound down, many of the Xylari began to leave, but Zara insisted that Marcus stay for a more private gathering with the inner council. The smaller group moved to a more intimate chamber, where the crystal wine flowed even more freely, and the conversation became more personal. Marcus lost track of time as he talked with Zara about philosophy, science, and the future of interspecies cooperation. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, alien yet somehow familiar, her thoughts and ideas challenging him in ways that made him think about everything differently. He barely noticed when the other council members drifted away, leaving just the three of them. Kira had been quieter during the private gathering, watching her sister and Marcus with an expression that he could not quite read. Finally, she announced that she needed to check on some experiments in her laboratory and left them alone together. The rest of the evening was a blur of conversation, laughter, and far too much crystal wine. Marcus remembered walking with Zara through the palace's garden of living crystals, marveling at how they sang in harmony with the wind. He remembered her explaining how Xylari could feel the emotions of the crystals around them and how the crystals responded to their thoughts and feelings in return. Most of all, he remembered the moment when Zara's control finally slipped, when the steady patterns under her skin began to dance with the same rapid intensity as her sister's, and how natural it felt when she moved closer to him in the starlight. Marcus woke up the next morning in Zara's chambers, sunlight streaming through, crystal walls in his head pounding from too much alien wine. Zara was still asleep beside him, but something was different about her. The patterns under her skin were not their usual pale blue, but a deep, rich purple that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. She looked more beautiful than ever, but also somehow changed in a way that made Marcus's stomach clench with worry. Before he could figure out what was happening, the chamber doors burst open and a group of Xylari officials rushed in, followed closely by a very concerned-looking Kira. They took one look at Zara's purple glowing skin and began speaking rapidly in their own language, their voices rising, with what sounded like panic. Kira pushed through the group and knelt beside her sister, placing her hands on Zara's forehead. After a moment, she looked up at Marcus with an expression of complete shock. "Ambassador Chen," she said slowly, "I think we have a problem, a very big problem." The journey to the third trial took longer than the previous two, leading Sarah through sections of the ship she had not seen before. These corridors were different from the grand ceremonial halls and functional spaces she had experienced earlier. Here the crystal walls were darker, more subdued, and the lighting was softer, almost melancholy. She passed chambers where Zephyrians sat in meditation, their skin displaying muted colors that suggested deep contemplation, or perhaps sadness. Princess Veltara walked beside her this time instead of meeting her at the destination, the alien. Princess had been quiet since leaving the psychic trial chamber, her silver skin shifting through patterns that Sarah was beginning to recognize as signs of internal conflict. "Your Highness," Sarah said carefully, "may I ask what the final trial involves?" The princess was silent for several more steps before answering. The third trial is different from the others, Sarah Chen. It is not a test of your abilities, but a test of your character. It is also... She paused, her skin flickering with colors that indicated uncertainty. It is also the most personal of the 3 challenges. They arrived at a chamber that was smaller and more intimate than the previous trial locations. The walls here were made of a smoky, translucent crystal that seemed to contain swirling mists. In the center of the room was not a chair or arena, but a simple circular platform large enough for 2 people to stand comfortably. Princess Veltara stepped onto the platform and gestured for Sarah to join her. As Sarah climbed up, she noticed that the princess's hands were trembling slightly, something she had not seen before in any Zephyrian. "What you are about to experience," the princess began, her mental voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it, "is not truly a trial in the traditional sense. It is something I have created specifically for you, based on what I learned from watching your previous challenges." Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. "I don't understand." The princess closed her large eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, Sarah could see something that looked remarkably like vulnerability. "The truth is, Sarah Chen, that I have been dying since before you arrived on our ship." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Dying, but you seem perfectly healthy." A bitter laugh escaped the princess's lips, a sound that was both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. "My family carries a curse that your scientists would probably call a genetic disorder. It is a plague of the mind that slowly destroys our psychic abilities and eventually our sanity. I have watched 3 of my siblings succumb to it over the past decade." As the princess spoke, the mists within the chamber walls began to swirl more actively, and Sarah realized that they were not just decorative, they were responding to the princess's emotional state. "The symptoms begin with small lapses in psychic control," Veltara continued. "Then come the headaches, the inability to filter out others' thoughts, and finally complete mental collapse. The royal family has hidden this affliction for generations, but it is growing stronger with each passing year." Sarah felt a deep sympathy for the alien princess, but she was also confused about why she was being told this. "Your Highness, I'm sorry for your suffering, but I don't understand what this has to do with the trial." Princess Veltara stepped closer, and Sarah could see tears forming in those large, luminous eyes. "Because, Sarah Chen, I have spent the last year convinced that when my time comes, I will face it alone and afraid, just as my siblings did. I believed that surrender to the inevitable was the only rational choice." The platform beneath their feet began to glow softly, and Sarah realized that some kind of psychic field was activating around them. "This final trial is not about testing your limits," the princess said, her voice now heavy with emotion. "It is about testing mine. I am going to share my memories with you, show you exactly what it means to face certain death with no hope of escape. And then I want to see if you, a being from a species I once considered primitive, will break the way I have been breaking." Before Sarah could respond, the world around them dissolved into shared consciousness. Suddenly, she was experiencing Princess Veltara's memories as if they were her own. She felt the princess's childhood joy, the wonder of discovering her psychic abilities, the pride of being born into royalty. But then came the first signs of the family curse. Sarah experienced the terror of watching Veltara's oldest brother begin to lose his mental faculties, becoming increasingly erratic and violent before finally collapsing into a catatonic state from which he never recovered. Turkey 1. Memories shifted to show the second sibling's decline. This one had tried to fight the disease, using every medical treatment and mental discipline available to their advanced civilization. Sarah felt the princess's hope as her sister seemed to improve for a few months, followed by crushing despair when the symptoms returned with doubled intensity. The third sibling had chosen a different path entirely. Rather than wait for the madness to claim him, he had ended his own life while his mind was still intact. Sarah felt the princess's grief and guilt, wondering if he had made the wise choice or simply given up too easily. But the most painful memory was yet to come. Sarah found herself experiencing the moment when Princess Veltara first felt the symptoms beginning in herself. The small headache that would not go away, the moment when she accidentally read the thoughts of a servant without meaning to, the growing realization that she was going to follow the same path as her siblings. Through the shared consciousness, Sarah could feel the princess's current state of mind. Veltara had spent months preparing herself for death, convincing herself that acceptance of the inevitable was a form of strength. She had become cold and distant not out of arrogance but out of a desperate attempt to protect herself from further emotional pain. But as Sarah experienced these memories and emotions, something unexpected happened. Instead of being overwhelmed by the princess's despair, she found herself responding with the same resilience she had shown in the previous trials. "Your Highness," Sarah said, her words somehow carrying across their shared mental space, "I understand your pain, and I understand your fear. But I think you may be missing something important." Through their connection, Sarah began sharing her own memories. Not memories of success or triumph, but memories of humans facing impossible odds and choosing to fight anyway. She showed the princess the story of her own grandmother, who had battled cancer for 7 years, not because she believed she would win, but because she refused to give up the time she had left. She shared the memory of a rescue worker she had once met, a man who spent his days pulling people from collapsed buildings even though he knew that someday he might not make it out himself. When asked why he continued such dangerous work, he had simply said that hope was not about believing in certain victory, but about believing that the fight itself had meaning. Most powerfully, Sarah shared the very human concept that suffering could be transformed into purpose. She showed the princess memories of people who had used their own pain to help others, who had found ways to make their struggles meaningful, even when they could not overcome them. In human culture, Sarah explained through their mental link, we have a saying, "It is not the length of life that matters, but the depth of it. Your siblings did not fail because they died, Your Highness. They would only fail if they died, without having truly lived." Princess Veltara's mental voice was filled with confusion and something that might have been hope. But how can there be meaning in inevitable defeat? How can there be purpose in fighting a battle that cannot be won? Sarah smiled, and somehow that simple human expression carried across their psychic connection with tremendous power. Because the fight itself changes who you are and who you help others become. Every day you choose to continue living, you are proving that life has value beyond its duration. Every moment you spend helping others, learning, growing, or simply being present in the world, you are making a choice that the disease cannot make for you. Through their shared consciousness, Sarah could feel something changing in the princess. The cold acceptance that had defined her for months was beginning to crack, replaced by something that looked remarkably like the human emotion of hope. "But what if the pain becomes too great?" the princess asked. "What if I lose my mind as my brothers did?" "Then you will face that when it comes," Sarah replied gently. "But until that moment arrives, you have the choice to live fully in whatever time you have. And if that day does come, you will face it knowing that you spent your remaining time fighting not just for yourself, but for the possibility of finding a cure for future generations." The shared psychic space began to fade as the trial's time limit approached, but Sarah could feel that something fundamental had changed in Princess Veltara. The alien's despair had not disappeared entirely, but it was no longer the defining feature of her existence. As they returned to normal consciousness, standing together on the platform in the crystal chamber, Princess Veltara looked at Sarah with an expression of wonder. "You have done something I thought was impossible, Sarah Chen," the princess said, her silver skin now displaying patterns of amazement and gratitude. "You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever." "What is that, Your Highness?" "The desire to see tomorrow." Captain Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the human diplomatic vessel Unity, watching the massive Zephyrian mothership grow larger through the reinforced viewport. The alien vessel was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It stretched for kilometers in every direction, its crystalline surface reflecting the light of 3 different suns. Beautiful geometric patterns ran across its hull, pulsing with soft blue and purple lights that seemed to follow some ancient rhythm. Sarah had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. She was humanity's best diplomat, chosen specifically for this historic first contact with the Zephyrian Empire. The stakes could not be higher. Earth needed allies, and they needed them desperately. The Void Swarm was coming, consuming entire star systems as it moved through the galaxy. Humanity had maybe 5 years before the swarm reached their sector of space. Without help, Earth would fall. The Zephyrians were humanity's only hope. Their empire spanned dozens of star systems, and their technology was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. More importantly, they had successfully fought off Void Swarm attacks in the past. If Sarah could secure an alliance, humanity might survive. If she failed, her species would face extinction. She adjusted her formal diplomatic uniform one final time and checked her appearance in the polished metal surface nearby. Everything had to be perfect. The Zephyrians were known to be extremely formal and traditional. Any mistake in protocol could end the negotiations before they began. The ship's communication system crackled to life. "Captain Chen, we are receiving docking clearance from the Zephyrian vessel. They are ready for the diplomatic ceremony." "Understood," Sarah replied. "Prepare the diplomatic team for transport." Minutes later, Sarah and her 5-person team stood in the transport bay. Each member had been carefully selected for their expertise. Dr. Martinez was their xenobiologist, Commander Torres was their military advisor, and the others were specialists in various fields of diplomacy and alien cultures. The transport beam activated, and Sarah felt the familiar tingling sensation as her body was disassembled and reassembled aboard the alien vessel. When the light faded, she found herself in a vast chamber that took her breath away. The room was enormous, easily the size of a football stadium. The walls were made of the same crystalline material as the ship's exterior. But here they were, transparent, offering a stunning view of space and the nearby star systems. The floor beneath their feet was smooth and warm, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as they walked. But it was the Zephyrians themselves that truly amazed Sarah. She had seen images and videos during her preparation, but nothing had prepared her for seeing them in person. They were tall, easily 8 feet in height, with slender builds that moved with incredible grace. Their skin appeared to be made of living crystal, shifting through different colors and patterns as they moved. Their faces were humanoid but ethereal, with large eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. At the far end of the chamber on a raised platform sat what could only be the Zephyrian royal family. The Emperor was an imposing figure, his crystalline skin a deep purple that pulsed with power. Beside him stood a younger female, her skin a beautiful silver color that reflected the light in mesmerizing ways. "That must be Princess Veltara," whispered Dr. Martinez. "She's even more striking than the intelligence report suggested." Sarah nodded but kept her focus on the approaching ceremony. A group of Zephyrian officials approached their delegation, moving with the same fluid grace as all their kind. The lead official, his skin a formal blue color, began to speak. His words came not just through sound but seemed to resonate directly in their minds. "Welcome, humans of Earth. You have been granted the rare honor of an audience with His Imperial Majesty and the royal family. You will approach the throne in single file, with your leader at the front. You will stop at the designated markers and wait for permission to speak." Sarah took a deep breath and began walking forward. The chamber was so large that it took several minutes to cross. With each step, she became more aware of the hundreds of Zephyrian nobles watching their every move. Their crystalline faces were difficult to read, but she could sense their curiosity and perhaps a touch of skepticism. The artificial gravity in the human transport had been set to Earth normal, but the Zephyrian ship operated at a slightly different setting. Sarah had trained for this, but as she walked, she could feel the subtle difference affecting her balance. The difference was small, but after the long walk across the chamber, she could feel herself becoming slightly unsteady. As they approached the royal platform, Sarah could see Princess Veltara more clearly. The princess was beautiful by any standard, but there was something cold and distant in her large, luminous eyes. Her silver skin shifted through different shades as she watched the human delegation approach. The Zephyrian official raised his hand, indicating they should stop at the marked positions. Sarah found herself standing directly in front of the royal family, perhaps 10 feet from the edge of their raised platform. The Emperor looked down at them with an expression that seemed both regal and curious. Humans of Earth. The Emperor's voice resonated in their minds with tremendous power. You have traveled far to reach us. We have heard of your species and your current difficulties with the entities you call the Void Swarm. Speak and tell us why the Zephyrian Empire should concern itself with the fate of your world. Sarah stepped forward slightly to address the Emperor. This was the moment everything depended on. She had rehearsed her opening speech countless times, but standing here in this alien throne room, with the fate of humanity resting on her words, the weight of responsibility was almost overwhelming. As she began to speak, the subtle gravity difference finally caught up with her. She had been standing for several minutes now, and the small but constant adjustment her body was making to the alien gravity was beginning to take its toll. Just as she started her prepared speech about humanity's desire for peaceful cooperation, she felt herself sway slightly to one side. Instinctively, Sarah reached out to steady herself. Her hand touched the edge of the royal platform, and in that same moment, Princess Veltara leaned forward slightly to better hear the human's words. Sarah's hand, seeking balance, brushed against the princess's arm. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Princess Veltara jerked back as if she had been struck, her silver skin flashing through a rapid series of colors that Sarah's briefings had told her indicated extreme distress and anger. The princess's large eyes widened in shock and fury. The entire chamber fell into complete silence. Every Zephyrian in the room seemed frozen in place. Even the shifting patterns on the walls appeared to pause. Sarah realized with growing horror that she had just made a terrible mistake, but she had no idea how terrible until the princess spoke. Princess Veltara raised her hand, pointing directly at Sarah. When she spoke, her voice carried such psychic force that all 5 humans winced and took a step backward. Touch me again, human, and you will pay the price. The words seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Sarah could see the shock and outrage on the faces of every Zephyrian noble in the chamber. Some were changing colors rapidly, which she knew indicated extreme emotional disturbance. Others had gone completely still, their crystalline skin taking on darker hues that suggested anger or disgust. The Emperor himself had risen from his throne, his purple skin now pulsing with dangerous energy. When he spoke, his mental voice was like thunder. In 3,000 years of Zephyrian civilization, no being of lesser evolution has ever dared to touch a member of the royal family without permission. This is a violation of our most sacred laws. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Years of preparation, humanity's last hope for survival, and she had destroyed it all with one accidental touch. The diplomatic mission that was supposed to save her species had just turned into a disaster that might doom them all. The emergency alarms grew louder as crystalline guards rushed through the corridors above them. Sarah could feel the vibrations through the chamber floor as hundreds of Zephyrians moved with urgent purpose throughout the palace. The harmonious tones that normally filled the air were replaced by discordant notes of panic and confusion. Lyrelith struggled to stand, her crystalline form flickering with unstable light patterns. The mind meld had affected her more deeply than either of them had expected. When she tried to speak, her musical tones were broken and uncertain, like a symphony with missing instruments. The connection. It went too far, Lyrelith managed to say. Your consciousness somehow traveled through our telepathic network. Other members of my species are experiencing human thought patterns for the first time in our history. Sarah pushed herself up from the crystal formation, her head spinning from the intensity of their shared experience. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Maybe this is exactly what needed to happen. But before Lyrelith could respond, the chamber doors burst open and a squad of Zephyrian guards entered. Their forms were larger and more angular than the civilian Sarah had met, with crystal formations that looked like natural armor. Behind them came Council Leader Meridian, his inner light pulsing with patterns that Sarah's translator interpreted as fury mixed with fear. Lyrelith of the Third Harmony, you have committed an act of unprecedented recklessness. Meridian's musical voice boomed through the chamber. The human contamination is spreading across our world. Already, 17. Individuals in the capital city alone have reported experiencing chaotic internal voices. Our physicians believe this mental virus could destroy the foundation of our civilization. Sarah stepped forward, trying to project diplomatic calm despite her racing heart. Council leader, what you call contamination might actually be evolution. The individuals experiencing these new thought patterns aren't being harmed. They're discovering new ways to think and create. Meridian's attention turned to Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like she was being examined under a microscope. Human, your species has brought chaos to our ordered world. The affected individuals are no longer able to participate in our telepathic harmony. They have become isolated, cut off from the shared consciousness that defines our society. This is exactly the kind of madness we feared would spread if we allowed contact with your kind. But even as Meridian spoke, Sarah could hear something different in the background harmonics that filled the chamber. Mixed in with the traditional Zephyrian, tones were new sounds, discordant notes that seemed to carry individual voices rather than the collective harmony she had grown accustomed to. Some of the affected Zephyrians were apparently nearby, and they were trying to communicate in ways their species had never used before. Lyreleth moved between Sarah and the council leader, her form still unsteady but her voice gaining strength. Meridian, I have experienced human consciousness directly. What we interpreted as madness is actually a sophisticated form of mental processing that gives humans remarkable adaptability and creativity. The individuals who are experiencing these new thought patterns are not being harmed. They are being enhanced. Enhanced? Meridian's light patterns shifted to what Sarah recognized as disbelief mixed with horror. They can no longer contribute to our collective decision-making processes. They think in isolation, pursuing individual goals instead of working for the harmony of all. This is not enhancement, Lyreleth. This is the destruction of everything we are as a species. The sound of running footsteps echoed from the corridors outside, and more Zephyrians began entering the chamber. But these newcomers were different from the guards and council members. Their light patterns were chaotic, flickering with the same kind of irregular rhythms that Sarah had noticed in Lyreleth after their mind meld. These were the affected individuals, the ones who had somehow caught the virus of human consciousness. One of them stepped forward, a young Zephyrian, whose crystalline form seemed to shimmer with newfound energy. When she spoke, her voice carried individual inflection that was unlike anything Sarah had heard from the species before. Council leader, the young Zephyrian said, I am crystalline of the seventh harmony, though I find myself questioning what harmony truly means. Since experiencing these new thought patterns, I have discovered ideas and perspectives that never occurred to me when my mind was linked to the collective. I have created music that comes from my individual experience rather than our shared consciousness. I have solved problems by arguing with myself, considering multiple viewpoints simultaneously. This is not madness, Meridian. This is freedom. More affected Zephyrians entered the chamber, each adding their individual voice to what was becoming a choir of unprecedented diversity. Sarah watched in amazement as these beings, who had lived their entire lives in perfect telepathic harmony, began to express ideas and emotions that were uniquely their own. We are not sick, another affected Zephyrian declared. We have not lost our ability to connect with others. We have gained the ability to choose when and how we connect. We can still sense emotions and share thoughts, but now we can also keep private thoughts, process experiences individually, and contribute unique perspectives to our collective understanding. Meridian's light patterns grew increasingly agitated as more affected individuals spoke. You have been isolated from the greater consciousness. You think you are gaining something, but you are actually losing the connection that makes us who we are as a species. This human influence must be stopped before it spreads further. But Sarah was beginning to understand that something much more significant was happening here than a simple case of mental contamination. The affected Zephyrians weren't losing their telepathic abilities. They were learning to use them in new ways, combining their natural capacity for shared consciousness with the human ability to think independently. One of the older affected Zephyrians, whose crystal form was marked with the deep facets that indicated advanced age, spoke with a voice that carried both wisdom and wonder. Meridian, I have lived for 3,000 of your years in perfect harmony with our people, but in the past few hours, since experiencing this new form of consciousness, I have had more original thoughts than in all my previous existence. I have questioned assumptions I never knew I was making. I have imagined possibilities that our collective consciousness would never have considered because they required individual perspective to conceive. Sarah felt a growing sense of hope as she watched the affected Zephyrians defend their new way of thinking. But her optimism was quickly dampened as she noticed the guards moving into position around the chamber. Meridian's light patterns had shifted to what she now recognized as the Zephyrian equivalent of grim determination. "This contamination ends now," Meridian announced. "The affected individuals will be isolated and treated until they can be restored to proper mental harmony. The human delegation will be destroyed to prevent further spread of this mental virus. Our civilization cannot survive if individual chaos replaces collective order." The guards began to advance, their crystalline forms glowing with energy patterns that Sarah's cultural briefings had never described. She realized with growing alarm that the Zephyrians possessed defensive capabilities that had never been mentioned during their diplomatic exchanges. Lyrelith stepped in front of Sarah, her own form beginning to glow with similar energy patterns. "Meridian, you cannot destroy what you do not understand. These humans have given us a gift that could transform our entire species. Individual consciousness does not replace collective harmony. It enhances it by adding the perspective of unique minds choosing to work together rather than being compelled to think alike." The chamber filled with tension as the traditional Zephyrians faced off against their affected brethren. Sarah found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming the first conflict in Zephyrian history, a civil war between those who cherished their ancient harmony and those who were discovering the power of individual thought. As energy began to build in the crystalline weapons of both sides, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of humanity's application to join the galactic concord, but the entire future of Zephyrian civilization. The question was no longer whether humans would be accepted as equals among the stars, but whether the gift of individual consciousness would survive to transform the galaxy, or be destroyed by those too afraid to embrace change. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to face Lyrelith. The Zephyrian's crystalline form stood perfectly still in the corridor, but her inner light was pulsing in rapid, irregular patterns that Sarah had never seen before. Something was very wrong, but Sarah forced herself to maintain her diplomatic composure. "Of course, Lyrelith. What would you like to know?" Sarah replied, though every instinct was telling her to run toward the shuttle bay and get off this planet as quickly as possible. Lyrelith moved closer, her movements more hesitant than the usual flowing grace of her species. When she spoke, the musical tones were quieter than normal, almost whispered. Sarah's translator worked to convert the complex harmonics into human speech, but even the mechanical voice seemed to carry an undertone of fear. "Commander Chen, why do your people sing to themselves when they believe no one is listening?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what Lyrelith meant. Humans didn't sing to themselves, at least not in any way that would be noticeable to aliens during formal diplomatic meetings. Sarah had been careful to follow all protocols, to present humanity in the most professional manner possible. "I'm not sure I understand your question," Sarah said carefully. "Can you explain what you mean by singing to ourselves?" Lyrelith's light patterns shifted to what Sarah had learned indicated deep distress among the Zephyrians. The alien being seemed to struggle with how to explain something that clearly troubled her greatly. "Your species, when you are alone, when you think others cannot perceive you, there is always music in your minds, not the harmonious songs of communication, but chaotic melodies that never stop. Each of you carries on constant conversations with invisible companions. We can sense these sounds, but we cannot understand them. They frighten us." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she began to understand. The Zephyrians were telepaths who could sense emotional and mental states. What they were picking up on wasn't singing at all. It was something far more fundamental to human consciousness, something so basic that Sarah had never even considered it might be unique to her species. They were sensing humanity's inner voice. Every human being carried on a constant internal monologue throughout their waking hours. They narrated their experiences to themselves, replayed conversations, planned future actions, argued with themselves about decisions, and maintained an endless stream of conscious thought. It was so natural that humans rarely even noticed they were doing it, but to telepathic aliens who were used to shared consciousness and harmony, it must sound like madness. Lyrillith, Sarah said slowly, what you're sensing isn't singing. It's how human minds work. We think in words and we talk to ourselves inside our heads. It's normal for us. The Zephyrian's form flickered with what Sarah now recognized as alarm. You speak of this as if it is natural, but no other species in the Concord possesses such chaos in their minds. The Altarian crystal singers think in pure musical concepts. The Vegan philosophers contemplate in mathematical equations. The Andromedan hive minds share singular thoughts across thousands of individuals. But humans appear to be constantly arguing with entities that do not exist. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the collapse of humanity's chances for galactic acceptance. To species that thought in concepts, images, or shared consciousness, the human inner voice must seem like a form of mental illness. How could she possibly explain that this wasn't insanity, but actually one of humanity's greatest strengths? It's not arguing with entities that don't exist, Sarah said desperately. It's how we process information, how we solve problems, how we make decisions. The voice in our heads is our own voice, not someone else's. Lyrillith moved even closer, and Sarah could see her reflection multiplied in the faceted surface of the alien's crystalline skin. Commander Chen, I must tell you something that will determine the fate of your species. The Council has been monitoring your delegation since your arrival. Our telepathic abilities allow us to sense the surface thoughts and emotional states of other beings. But with humans, we experience something we have never encountered before. Sarah waited, dreading what she was about to hear. Every member of your team maintains constant mental activity that appears to be conversations with unseen individuals. Your linguist, Dr. Martinez, spends hours each day apparently discussing grammar structures with invisible teachers. Your cultural specialist, Professor Kim, seems to be constantly debating the meaning of our customs with phantom advisors. Even you, Commander, appear to rehearse speeches and arguments with imaginary opponents. The full scope of the disaster began to dawn on Sarah. Everything the human delegation had done to appear professional and competent had been undermined by something they couldn't control and hadn't even known was visible to their hosts. The Council has concluded, Lyrillith continued, that humanity suffers from a species-wide psychological disorder that makes your people unstable and potentially dangerous. The constant presence of these mental voices suggests a form of collective madness that could pose a threat to other telepathic species if allowed to spread. Sarah felt the weight of her species' future crushing down on her. Lyrillith, please, you have to understand. This isn't madness. This is just how human consciousness works. We don't have invisible companions or phantom advisors. We're thinking through problems, considering different perspectives, preparing for challenges. It's a sign of intelligence, not insanity. But even as she spoke, Sarah could see that her explanation was falling on deaf ears. How could she make a species that had evolved perfect telepathic harmony understand that chaos and internal conflict could actually be beneficial? Lyrillith's light patterns shifted to something that Sarah's cultural training told her indicated deep sadness. I have grown fond of your species during our time together, Commander. Your art, your literature, your capacity for individual expression, these things fascinate me in ways I cannot fully explain. But the Council fears that allowing humans into the Concord would be like inviting a plague of mental instability into our peaceful alliance. Sarah's mind raced, her inner voice working frantically to find a solution to this impossible problem. Ironically, the very thing that was damning humanity was also working overtime to save it. She was considering dozens of different approaches, weighing options, discarding ideas and formulating new strategies all at once. What can we do? Sarah asked. Is there any way to prove that we're not insane? Any test or demonstration that could show the Council that our inner voices are actually a strength rather than a weakness? Lyrillith was quiet for a long moment, her inner light pulsing in slow, thoughtful rhythms. When she finally spoke, her words carried a mixture of hope and fear that made Sarah's heart race even faster. There is one possibility, but it has never been attempted with an alien species. Our people have a ritual called the mind meld of understanding, where two individuals join their consciousness temporarily to share thoughts and experiences directly. If you were willing to undergo this process with me, I could experience your inner voice firsthand and determine whether it truly represents madness or something else entirely. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Has any non-Zephyrian ever attempted this mind meld? No, Lyrillith admitted, and our medical specialists believe that the alien neural patterns could cause permanent damage to both participants. The risk is enormous. Sarah looked toward the shuttle bay where her team was waiting, then back at Lyrillith. The choice was impossible but clear. She could leave now and let humanity be marked as a species of lunatics unfit for galactic society, or she could risk her sanity and possibly her life for the chance to prove that the human inner voice was not a curse but a gift. If I agree to this mind meld, Sarah said, and if something goes wrong, will you at least tell the council that we tried, that humans were willing to risk everything to prove we're not the monsters you think we are? Lyrillith's crystalline form seemed to shimmer with emotion. Commander Chen, if you are willing to undergo the mind meld of understanding, I will ensure that your courage is remembered regardless of the outcome. But you must understand that no one knows what will happen when a human consciousness encounters Zephyrian telepathy directly. Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. Then let's find out.